A dáme priestor tomuto mimoriadnemu človeku pod hlavičkou a pod značkou Clubovka. To je mimoriadne dôležitá značka pre Dni architektúry a dizajnu. Projekt a priestor na stretávanie sa, ktorý sa zrodil v Prešove a ktorý naozaj spojil množstvo umelcov v dôležitých inšpiratívnych debatách a ktorý sa presunul do Bratislavy a stál taktiež na začiatku vzniku Dní architektúry a dizajnu. Takže práve pod hlavičkou Clubovky teraz prebehne ďalšia prezentácia a po nej aj debata. Henrieta Moravčíková sa k nám pripojí opäť potom, ako zaznie prezentácia a pozhovára sa pod hlavičkou Clubovky s našim ďalším hosťom. A teda tým hosťom je architekt, ktorý patrí do ateliéru John Caruso z Londýna. Adam Caruso a Peter St. John už teda naozaj majú čo to za sebou. Pravidelne obsadzujú vysoké priečky v cenách ako Mies van der Rohe Award alebo Ryba v portfóliu. Dominujú budovy kultúrnych inštitúcií a rekonštrukcie ako Damien Hirst Newport Street Gallery v Londýne, Filharmonia v Liverpoole, konverzia priemyselného komplexu Lycée Hotelier v Lille alebo budova Landesbank v Brémach. Hovoria, že zaujíma nás emocionálne pôsobenie architektúry, zaujíma nás, ako sa budovy stavali v minulosti a ako môžu nové stavby aj dnes dosiahnuť rovnocennú formálnu a materiálnu kvalitu. Naozaj silné slová a veľký príbeh za ateliérom John Caruso. Po prezentácii, pripomínam ešte raz, prebehne debata, nenechajte si ju újsť, ale poďte si najskôr vypočuť rozprávanie, s ktorým, veľmi si to vážime, prichádza na Dni architektúry a dizajnu Adam Caruso.
Hello. My lecture this evening is called What Future for the City? And I'm going to try and talk about the city and the work that we've made for European cities. Because really, since Peter, St. John and I began our practice almost 30 years ago, the genius of the European city and the way in which it embodies the history and the diverse cultures of Europe has really been the most important theme in our discussions, in our teaching, and in our work. I'm giving this lecture in Bratislava, but because of the strange circumstances of these times, I'm not able to visit the city, which is a disappointment for me, because I can imagine Bratislava is one of a group of these great Central European cities, which, although they had more ancient origins, experienced kind of quite magnificent expansions in the 19th century when there was an unprecedented confidence and knowledge about how to make the city. We're not in the 19th century, we're in the 21st century today. And although as European architects and urban inhabitants, we can enjoy the results of people of administrators, of politicians, and of architects and urbanists who really had a confidence and a knowledge about how to make the city. In the 21st century, those things are far from certain. We're in a period of late capitalism where property, which in the 19th century as well was considered an asset class. It was considered something with which one could make money. Having property was a sign of wealth and of power. But from the perspective of today, in the 19th century, those economic and political attributes of property were balanced with attributes that were different. Some of them were also a little bit questionable. Property could also be a way of expressing power and of even controlling people, like Haussmann's Paris, which is a magnificent, maybe the paradigm of the 19th century city, and yet also had a very strong kind of security impetus but behind the logic of its design. But it was also that the city was meant to be a kind of an infrastructure or an edifice within which public life, the commercial, but also the representational, the grand, as well as the everyday, all of these things could take place. And it's amazing how the 19th and, say, early 20th century city is so much an expression of this diversity and this life, and how it's still very useful today. But in the period of late capitalism, the potential of real estate to be an asset into which one can sink money from investment funds and from pension funds, from where one can globalize capital lands and is able to maximize its yields. This has had an enormously distorting effect on the design of cities. So I'm giving this lecture about a subject that I really love. I'm giving it now because although for years the idea of building major urban buildings for Peter and I was a kind of a dream, something that we made competitions about, but never really thought we'd be able to do. But in the last few years, we've actually built a number of major urban buildings, and I'm only showing you some of them. And I'm showing them to you in order to show how different they are, because they are, I think, every building I'm showing you is in a different city. But they're also different because there's so many possibilities when you're really thinking positively and deeply about the city. There's so many possibilities about what your architecture can be about. But as I said, I'm talking about the city because I feel so strongly about it today, but I also feel not so optimistic about the future of the city. I think we might have passed a line across which the idea to contribute in a positive way to the city is becoming more and more difficult, to the point where it's almost becoming impossible. I'm going to start the lecture by showing a series of images that were made by a friend and collaborator of the practice, Philip Heckhausen, who is an architect, but an architect who's given up practice to become an architectural photographer and a photographer of the city. And when we were invited to contribute to the last Venice Biennale, we made a room in the main exhibition building where we talked about the facades of buildings. So we showed drawings of the facades of our buildings, but we also commissioned Philip to take a quite wide series of portraits of cities that we really love, mostly European cities, although there were a few American examples that crept in there. And some of the photographs had our projects in them. About half of the ones I'll show you have our projects in them, but in Venice, only maybe 10 or 15% had Caruso St buildings in them. So I'm just going to go quickly through these photographs, and you'll see the quality of these photographs is that they don't show a single building. They're not photographs of monumental public buildings, so they're not about museums or law courts or parliament buildings. Rather, they're photographs of the ordinary streets of the city. And streets that are made often not in a single time, but across maybe a period of 100 years. And yet, because of the strength and the quality of the city, but also because the respect that the contemporary architects of each age have for that city, there's a kind of amazing and almost magical balance between diversity, which shows the age of the building and the use of the building, but also a certain respect for certain consistencies in terms of scale, materials, typology. So the first image is of Via Manin in Milan, and the building in front on the right is one of Asnago Vender's early masterpieces in Via Manin, just an apartment building that still actually is owned by the original client. It's a building that was finished between the two world wars. The next image is in London, and it has one of our buildings, which I'll be talking about later. So Newport Street Gallery is on the left, and it's occupying the whole length of a block of street in Lambeth. And its neighbor across the street is a railway viaduct, a very busy one that has trains going into Waterloo Station every minute or two. It was a rather cold day when Philip took this photograph. Another photograph of Milan, and I really do think that 20th century Milan is one of the kind of really amazing modern cities, and a city that people don't really talk about when they talk about 20th century cities. Milan is a city that was 70% rebuilt after the Second World War. So it's a city that engages in a very substantial way with modernization and with being an industrial city. And yet, being in Italy, somehow the architects of, especially the architects of a couple of generations, architects who were born around the turn of the 20th century, they had a kind of intuition and a respect and an ability to make urban buildings that is really extraordinary. So straight ahead, we have a very special complex of commercial and housing buildings by Cacciadomignoni, one of the great members of that generation of Milanese architects. This is a photograph from the center of Zurich, which is the other place other than London where we have an office. And this is right at the Paradeplatz, so at the center of the very small monumental core of Zurich. And it's a building by the Gebrüder Fisker, a really great practice of three brothers who did a number of very important institutional, but also commercial buildings in Zurich in the teens and the 20s. This is a commercial building with shops and offices, and Paradeplatz is directly to the left of this image. This is another one of our projects. It's the headquarters for the Bremer Landesbank that we finished a few years ago. Incredibly special site right at the center of Bremen on the Domshof, so facing the cathedral of this city and next to the town hall. And I'll talk more about that later in the lecture. Another image from the middle of, well, the 20th century center of Milan, the Racchetta, a kind of network of 5 major new streets where all of the buildings are post-war buildings. I think directly on the left, no, it isn't. I thought it was Torre Velasca. It's not Torre Velasca, but it's just Torre Velasca is just behind us towards the left. So none of these buildings are excellent, but they all contribute to the continuity and to the vitality of this metropolis. This is Zurich again, looking down from the Caserna, also near the center of the city and towards Europalais, this entirely new quarter that was built just next to the main railway station. And our building was one of the first buildings that was part of this new quarter. And I'll be talking about that as well later. Vienna, and you can see the Kleines Café, the beautiful and very famous and getting old cafe designed by Hermann Czech in the center of Vienna, within the Baroque city. Zurich again, this is Zurich West, so the ex-industrial area of Zurich, which still has some industry, but is largely gentrified. On the right-hand side, one of the major railway viaducts of the city, a monumental structure that was built at the beginning of the 20th century. And straight ahead, the building that we did for St. Jakob Foundation, which I'll talk about later, which actually is a factory building, but just built today, nowadays. So a kind of interesting decision by the city to build a new industrial building in an area, a previously industrial area, which has largely been gentrified. And finally, a last image of Milan, of Lancia and Ponti's amazing double building at the Porta Venezia. One building, but that has the expression of a palazzo and of a tower simultaneously. So really what I'm showing with these images is that the city, the vitality, the richness the things that we really enjoy about the city, they don't come from the city's monuments. They don't come from grand urban plans and from axes. What they actually come from is from a texture of the city. It can come from big buildings, but it also comes from small buildings, and it actually comes from a condition of incredible heterogeneity, but a heterogeneity that stops short of being a kind of free-for-all. This isn't the heterogeneity of a new city in China, in the Gulf states, or in Canary Wharf in London. This is a heterogeneity where one looks at what came before us, but then one adds something new, but something that somehow, somewhere within its character is referring to the existing place. And now I'm going to show, I think, 5 projects that we've completed in the last 8 years, I think. Some are very, very recent. And as I said, I think a couple are from Zurich, but they're from different cities. And you'll see how a single practice, Caruso St, working in different city centers, how within our work, we've, in a way, celebrated and really been inspired by the difference of the different situations and how we've allowed these differences to really inform what the character of the buildings would be, but also how we refer to certain paradigmatic urban buildings. So the buildings of Milan that I showed you, those are often references for us that somehow those references creep into the designs for buildings in Zurich, but it could also be creeping into the design for a building in Cologne. So the first building I'm going to show you is part of this new quarter at the center of Zurich called Europalais. It's built on railway lands next to the main station. I remember when we were invited for this competition, which was the 3rd competition on the site, that we were told that this is the 3rd of 15 buildings and that the whole project will be finished in a 10-year period. And being from London, we were slightly skeptical that one could plan so precisely and with such certainty, but sure enough, Europalais is now complete. The last buildings of Europalais have just been finished in the last 6 months. And even with the coronavirus, the ground floor of Europalais has retail and eating places, and it's really become a seamless part of the city. Of course, it's also an example of commercial architecture as a kind of exploitation of real estate. I'm, under no illusions that it's anything but that. And the SBB, the developer is the Swiss Railway, but the Swiss Railway are as tough as any other developer. But because it was in the city center, because the competitions for these buildings were run by the city, who made quite strong demands on the SBB about the quality of the buildings, but also the use. So you'll see our buildings, which is this building here, is an office building for the first 4 floors above retail, and then these 2 towers, which have quite luxurious rental flats. So it's really a kind of paradigmatic urban city center building with a mix of uses. And what we tried to, I'll just go through what the uses are. So this is this part of Europalais. This is our building, a building for UBS, which was designed by Max Dudler, Gigon Guyer, and David Chipperfield, and then a very large building which has a university and some offices by Max Dudler. So our building, this is the ground floor. The ground floor has the entrances to the offices, to the parking, to the apartments, and has retail. So it's quite complicated, the ground floor, to reconcile all of these entrances and exits. Then the next 4 floors are a very standard floor plates for office space, quite deep at the time for the Zurich market, but actually we were a little bit ahead of the curve because now there's a lot of office space that's been built with this sort of depth. And then above that, these 2 towers of apartments, very big mix of apartments, so different kinds of apartments on different floors. And these are plans of the 2 top floors, so the penthouses, which are really quite luxurious, 2 and 3 bedroom flats. And you can see very ambitiously planned, and I'll show you a few photographs later. But for us, you know, the program is a given. It's an urban building. It has these commercial uses, and they have to be accommodated in a good way. But for us, the really interesting thing was, how do you make a building whose image and whose construction and whose presence in this place will really contribute to the idea of a city that's based on existing streets. So this one, Lagerstraße, but then this street, which is this new street called Europalais. And our idea was that we would make a building out of masonry, not stone, because if we made it out of stone in the 21st century, the stone would be rather thin and it would really feel like a veneer, but rather with large precast elements which are supporting themselves, so that the idea of the structure of the facade, the performance of the facade, is somehow making the image of the building more communicative. And you can see that the facade is a bit heavier at the bottom and it gets lighter as you go up, and that the way in which window openings responds, and I'll go through this in a moment, between the retail spaces, the office spaces, and the apartments, and that in a way the kind of very practical requirements of the program connected to the formal and constructional ideas of the architecture give the building its image, give the building the means with which to become an articulate part of the city. So these are the elevations. We had a bit of an innovation that we didn't build as high as we could to make the eave of the building. So instead of being like these buildings, 25 meters, we just did a 16-meter eave, which is what the buildings across the street are. And the reason we did that was that then these towers, where the residential accommodation was, would feel taller. They would be more differentiated. So this is one of the elevations. And these are some of the drawings of the construction of these elements. So there's an arcade at the head of the building, which has a bar, and it has these curtain-like precast elements in green. And then the more standard facade with these large column elements and beams and infills. And this is the residential entrance, which is more elaborated, and the shop front. The shop fronts, which are made in polished precast concrete, and the transition from the office building to the apartments, which need to have more flexibility in terms of having loggias and balconies and opening windows and smaller rooms like bedrooms and larger rooms like living rooms. So there's quite a bit of variety within the facade, but that variety is controlled with an overall tectonic identity, which is about these columns and the beams. We worked with an amazing precast company based in Flanders called De Como. It was their first and almost their only building in Switzerland. It's very unusual for subcontractors from outside Switzerland to be involved in Swiss buildings, but they won this contract. And we did many, many tests about the textures and the finishes that one can achieve in precast. I mean, precast concrete really is like the stone was in the 19th century. You know, it's a way of making incredibly high quality and differentiated material without involving enormous human power. You don't need to carve it, you can cast it. So these are this is the building. So this is that arcade I talked about with the bar and the green curtain-like facade infilling it. The residential entrance and the office facades. All of these are precast elements. They're all holding their own weight. So all of these elements are sitting on a foundation on the ground. The bar facade, the entrance to the apartments with the detail of the lighting. You can really see how fine the detail of precast today can be made. It's nothing like the precast in the 60s, which was much more porous and much more susceptible to staining and failure. The lobbies to the apartments, which are quite luxurious and veneered in olive wood. One of the apartments on the top floor where each apartment has a fireplace, kind of crazy. And then the details around the ground floor of the entrance. So these beautiful polished precast elements for the shops. Look at these shapes that you can achieve. The entrance to the offices. So here an element which looks like the precast, but actually it's too big to be precast. So it was made in situ, but with the same mold as the precast was used. And finally, the largest piece on the building, again done in situ, the enormous beam which spans over the entrance to the underground car park, a kind of cyclopean surprise on one of the side streets. So this was the first new commercial building we ever managed to build. It was finished about 6 or 7 years ago. Kind of tough developer client, a tough contractor, but really a situation because of the city architect and because of a real demand for quality at the center of Zurich, a place where we're really able to achieve many of the things that we imagined you could achieve in making an urban building today. And I think it's a building that does make a contribution to that part of the center of Zurich. So my next project is also in Europe. It's in Bremen, a kind of very old northern German city, a city that was an important Hanseatic port. So a city that has a very specific architectural tradition of building in brick. You know, Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck, all of those cities who are Hanseatic port cities had this amazing big brick tradition. And we were invited to do a competition to make a headquarters building for the Bremer Landis Bank, which is the local bank which supports local businesses, to replace a building that they built in the 1980s, which was functionally a very poor building, but architecturally was even worse. And the building couldn't be on a more important site. This is the cathedral. This is the cathedral square. This is the town hall, which is a Renaissance building with additions from the 19th century and also a very, very high quality addition from the 20th century. This is another church, and there's a network of markets for food and for flowers that surrounds the building. So the area is called the Domshof, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So we were invited to do this competition. We had buildings like this on our mind. This is a building by Pulzig in Hanover. It's just an office building, a kind of office and industrial building, but a building that really is a kind of fine example of this Hanseatic brick tradition. And we made a project in brick, which I'll show you in a moment. The program, it's really an office building for about 500 people. It had a very, very prescriptive program which told you exactly how many desks had to be in what kind of office. And the way we organized the building is we made a courtyard. The Domshof is on this side, on the right. There was an existing facade from the original headquarters building from the end of the 19th century. This is the new facades, and we made this building, which is like a donut, really, which on the upper floor, you can see how efficient it is. So it has offices around the perimeter, offices around the courtyard, and kind of combi zone in the middle. On the ground floor, there's a banking hall on the Domshof and a porte cochere, which gives way to an entrance in the courtyard. And the courtyard is publicly open, and they have concerts and things like that in the courtyard. And then on the other part of the ground floor, there's retail. So again, a very typical urban program, but it's also a head office for an important company in the town. We were the only non-German practice to be invited into the competition, and much to our surprise, we were the only practice who proposed a brick building. a brick building for a city which is famous for its brick buildings. All of the German architects proposed concrete buildings. And even though I think our building was a little bit rich for the client, who would have preferred something a bit more explicitly modern, there was a very good jury and an excellent city architect in the competition jury, and we won. And in the end, we had an excellent relationship with the bank, and it was a kind of incredibly productive experience to make this very special building in this special place. So this is a drawing of the facade, actually done. We did a drawing like this for the competition, but this was done when the building was finished. This is one of the drawings that we showed in Venice, actually, in this exhibition where we were showing urban facades. And this is a drawing that shows the plan detail of the facade, starting at the bottom, where the piers are very big, and there's a kind of double order, and then getting finer and finer until the middle of the building where every bay of the window is expressed, and then to the top of the building, which is even finer, where the brickwork becomes terracotta. And this is a photograph of the building in the Domshof. Yeah, it's a building that's completely about being in Northern Germany. I mean, the tradition of this kind of Northern German architecture is closely related to English arts and crafts architecture. So we felt a closeness to it, where Peter and I have for a long time really loved English arts and crafts architecture, and the way it kind of was it's really maybe the only time British architecture was avant-garde at the end of the 19th century, architects like Philip Webb and Richard Norman Shaw. So it was typologically very progressive, but it also was referring in a very interesting and synthetic way to the traditions of earlier British architecture. And I think this Hanseatic brick architecture in cities like Bremen and Hamburg is similar. So you can see the building. This is facing the Domshof with the big entrance to the banking hall, which I'll show you later, the entrance to the car park and to a public toilet, which was part of our project, and then the offices. And then this kind of roof level, which is also offices, but with a terrace and kind of private banking at this level that can make use of these terraces. This is St. Peter's Church. This is the Rathaus next to the building, and behind us to the left is the cathedral. This is looking closer at the building, and you can see, I mean, it was obviously a very long process of detailed design to develop these facades, which are also holding their own weight. So the facades are sitting on their own foundation. These bricks are specially made by a local brick maker. That's quite common in Northern Germany, that you design a brick and then a brick maker makes it. So there's 6 different kinds of bricks on this facade, and there was no prefabrication in this facade. We talked about that, but we really wanted to make a facade that had no silicon, where all of the forces, you understand the forces coming down to the ground, but also that there's this kind of quality of weaving, of breathing and of weaving, especially in these places, which are the kinds of qualities that you see in a 1920s brick facade in Bremen. But in other respects, the building feels very, very contemporary. When you're very close to the building, it also has a kind of material brutality. You completely understand that this brick facade is holding itself up and it's standing there, and that the elaboration and the power of this facade is only justified because it's built on the Domshof. You know, it's not so much a symbol of the bank, although it's a little bit about that this bank is a safe place to put your money, but it's much more that this urban space already has this extraordinary collection of buildings from the 13th century, from the 16th century, from the 19th century, from the 20th century, and that we have a responsibility to add to this constellation, this incredible urban constellation of building. This is the other arch, which is on the side street. So this is the arch which leads into a porte cochere, which leads into the courtyard. And the courtyard, which refers very heavily, maybe some of you recognize that it's referring to Sigurd Leverentz's Social Security office in Stockholm, a building whose plan works in a very similar way, with offices around the courtyard and around the external walls, and which has a very similar proportion. So the courtyard is made in stucco, but then there's a big precast concrete bench that goes around the whole of the base, so that you can go into the courtyard, or you could come out of your office and eat your lunch there. And when they have concerts, you sit there. And there's 3 ginkgo trees, which are now larger. And that's the inside view of the porte cochere. And then this is the main archway that's leading to the banking hall. And this is a real brickwork arch that was made with timber false works. And yeah, it's quite an amazing thing to see them build this. I mean, of course, it's special that in a place like Northern Germany, but also in Britain, that if you design something like this, there are people who have experience and an enthusiasm and energy for building in this way. And clearly this facade is not cheap, but the building overall was not expensive. It was a kind of mid-budget office building. But because we were on the Domshof, because of the involvement of the city architect and the conservation authorities, there never was really much of a challenge that these facades had to be what they had to be in order to be appropriate for this site. And then this is the banking hall, which is lined entirely in white tiles. It's not so heavily used, which was sort of predictable when we were designing it, because most people bank online. And so the only reason you go into a bank is to open an account or to talk to an advisor. But it's a very nice public space, which is off the main square, and there's comfortable leather sofas where you can hang out a little bit. And then this is a view in the other direction, where you see what happens with this entrance portal on the inside. It isn't an entrance portal through an enormously thick facade. Rather, it's a little bit like an elephant's trunk, which is moving into the space. It's meant to be a little bit witty. You don't want the building to be too ponderous and monumental. And then a final view of the facade. So yeah, that was this is really a situation which is exactly what I was talking about right at the beginning, about building in the city, and that building in the city carries with it certain responsibilities, but responsibilities that can be full of potential, and as an architect can be really so inspiring. The next building is a kind of completely different kind of building. It's in Zurich West in Zurich, which used to be an industrial area. I talked about it before, and it's largely gentrified. But the interesting thing in Zurich is they always try and keep all of the areas of Zurich mixed. This is this enormous viaduct I was talking about. And this is the building. And the building, I'll come back to that. The building is a factory building for a foundation called the St. Jakob Foundation, who employ disabled people. They have a bakery, they have a facilities management company, they do joinery, they do all sorts of things. And they had a factory in another part of town. They'd outgrown it, so they needed a new factory building. And so we looked at 2 things as a reference. One of the things we looked at was this plan, which is Louis Sullivan's Carson Pirie Scott. So it's an American department store, which is sort of the most dumb plan you can imagine, with the core pushed to the edge and then as much open space as possible. But we looked also, and it's a kind of slightly absurd juxtaposition, at this building, which is the Palazzo of Shells in Salamanca, which has this ornament of seashells. And because our building is for St. Jakob, and they have the St. Jacob's shell as their symbol, their logo, so we made a building that you'll see in a moment has something to do with that. So the plans of the building are brutally efficient. So this is a typical plan. You can see the core is here on the west with 2 stairs, some lifts and the toilets, and then there's an open space for production and assembly. And then there's a balcony around the edge, which allows you to go outside and have a rest, but it also means that we don't need any fire escape stairs anywhere else. So all of the escape stairs can be at the western end, which means that the rest of the plan can stay as open as possible. So it means it's a brutally efficient plan. This is the ground floor that has the bakery. It's bigger. You'll see it's on a kind of a plinth. And then the upper plan. And this is the building looking through one of the archways of the viaduct. This is the street facade, Heinrichstrasse, where you have this seashell facade. And then you can see on the side, there's this plinth where the bakery is and the offices for the foundation. And then the other, it's like a flatted warehouse building. And in common with the other 2 buildings I showed you, this part of the facade is load bearing as well. So this balcony idea means that the structure can be cold. So it means that it's a real structure. And so that the problem of it holding its own weight gives a certain power and energy to it. But in other respects, the facades of the building are using a lot of technical tricks, and things are not always what they appear to be. Oh dear, I have to go back. I don't know what that was. Sorry about that. This is the rear facade looking south, where there's a cafe at the ground floor, and then these open verandas in a way for the workshops. And on the top, there's a mensa and a kind of community room for the foundation. The street facade, which is precast concrete. So these elements are 18 or 20 centimeters thick with these seashells cast into the surface. But then around the rest of the other facades on the plinth of the building are actually made of fiber cement, which is only 20 millimeters thick. So it's much, much thinner. And you can see it sort of bends up like a piece of paper to make a place for the marquise, the sun protection to park. So although the 2 look the same, they're both white, they're actually working in a very different way. They cost a different amount, but they kind of have a uniformity. And of course, the structure of the balcony is also precast because it's structural, it has reinforcement in it. There's the bakery, and they sort of have this very close interface to the surrounding streets, which was something the foundation was interested in to show how their people do their work. And then the stuff that they make in the bakery goes all over the city, but it also then goes to the cafe, which is in the building, which is here. And there's a small planted park, and it's a very pleasant space, which people in the whole quarter use. View again, this is the entrance to the building. So you can see that these entrances are all where there's a cut made into the building are clad in different colored tiles. So yellow tiles making the cafe looking south, green tiles at the entrance of the St. Jacob entrance, and the loading bay because they have vans going in and out 24 hours a day because it's a bakery. And then on the verandas, it's red. And then on the inside, it's really a factory building. So this is the core zone to the west of the building from one of the stairs. The stairs are very generous because that's the way people go up and down the building. This is the sort of common space. The toilets, the entrances to the toilets, and this is the factory spaces. Very, very basic. This is a building that was not expensive. It was also built with a kind of very particular total contractor contract where we worked for the contractor. Actually, the competition was with the contractor. So the competition was for a design and for a price. The view on the veranda, a view out to other parts of Zurich West and the old grain silo, and there's a new silo. Those of you who know Zurich know about it. It's 120 meters high. Yes, and our building and the viaduct and the way they make a street between each other. The viaduct has been renovated and it has retail units and restaurants in it. So this becomes a kind of city street, but a city street within this area that still has a very clear industrial morphology. It's really an amazing opportunity. So making this headquarters for a bank in Bremen was amazing, but it's also just making an industrial building, but an industrial building in such a special and such a central place in the city also is amazing. You know, it's full of opportunities, and you can see how this building, it has a completely different expression from the Bremen building, because it's not in northern Germany, it's in Zurich, but also because it's a factory building. It's not a headquarters for a bank, you know, and those things I think still are relevant when you're designing a building as an architect. You know, not all buildings have to be made out of glass, you know, or have funny shapes. I think, although, you know, this building does have some funny shapes, like this kind of special place right at the top where the Mensa is, where people can go out. Okay, the next project I'm showing is in Antwerp, in Flanders, in the old dock area, which is has some similarities with the site I just showed you in Zurich. It's an area which used to be industrial and had a lot of workers' housing. And it's been the area of a lot of redevelopment in the last 15 years in Flanders. Flanders, of course, has a really amazing architecture scene. So for us, it was really interesting to become engaged in it. And we were invited into this competition, which was also a developer competition. So we were invited by a developer, but I think our name was cleared by the city architect to make this project, which was part of a master plan, a greater master plan that had been made by Rapp and Rapp architects, and who had already made this building. So this building was already under construction when we did this. So it's in the old dock area on a street called Falkenplain, and it's on the site of an old convent, so an old institutional, religious institutional building. So this is our site, and the competition, it was very kind of optimistic and almost idealistic. It's a competition where we made the competition with a number of other architects. So we were the main architects, and we made the big building, which is a mixed-use building with ateliers and a kindergarten and community spaces on the ground floor, and then apartments above. But then we were collaborating with Dirk Sommers of Bovenbouw, with Rapp and Rapp, with another young Flemish firm, Ono. So there was a number of architects working together to make this whole urban ensemble, which is around a court space, which was what the master plan said you should do. And through various porte cochères here and here and here, I can show you on the plan, here and here and here and here, you can get into this courtyard, which is a public space. And from the courtyard, you can get into the kindergarten, you can get into most of the apartments, you can get into the community space and into the ateliers. So really a kind of almost a 19th century idea or early 20th century idea of the kind of artisanal city. So a program which really goes very well with the history of the area, and a density which is completely reasonable. An interesting thing about the project was that the city was demanding that it had a very, very high environmental rating. So it had to have BREEAM outstanding. And even within the master plan, there were things that were done to accommodate that. So the floor to ceiling heights for the apartments were over 3 meters, so that you had maximum daylight penetration into the unit. So you could really benefit from natural light and minimize the use of artificial light, and also maximize the potential of cross ventilation. So there were a lot of really nice things in the project. And the developer, who's a quite important Flemish developer, was really a great collaborator on the project. So this model is something, it's a big model that was done at 1:50, is something we did during the competition. And you'll see in some respects, what was built hasn't changed very much. I mean, the tectonic development of the project has changed a bit. It's developed, it hasn't changed. That's the street view where our big L-shaped building just becomes one of the houses on the street. So this is the street. The other buildings aren't finished yet. So in a way, the photographs I'm going to show you, it's only the project 2/3 complete. It was only finished a couple of months ago. But this is how our building appears on the street, with this big ground floor spaces, which are 5.5 meters high. So they're big, big spaces. And the idea is that they're ateliers, offices, a kindergarten. All of the spaces have the potential to have mezzanines put into them. And you'll see that the building has this expression of a base with this kind of these big consoles, which then hold either this open veranda, and that because the floor to ceiling heights are so big, the veranda can really be deep, so it really becomes an outdoor space that you can use, or there's brick facades, and you'll see them as I go through the slides. But this is the presence of the building on the street, and you can see it's very similar to what we had in the competition. So that's, you see, these are 2 atelier units with apartments above. And then we're now in the courtyard, but on the left is the porte cochere, so the way that we got from the street into the courtyard. And this is an atelier and one of the entrances to the apartments. And then that's the courtyard. So you see the kind of, there's a very strong tectonic order, like all of the projects I'm showing you, but you can see that it's very, very different than the Zurich buildings or the Bremen building. I mean, here we're really trying to engage with a way of making architecture that has something to do with Flanders, a tradition which is even closer to the English tradition, say, than Bremen is. A tradition of making buildings in brick, of vertical window openings, of a kind of cold and rainy climate, you know, where outdoor spaces have to be generous or they become damp and unpleasant, and of even the idea of the courtyard or the square. You know, you can make a connection to the idea of squares in British cities. So this is a view of the courtyard, the common garden, and this is the kindergarten, which I'll show you in a moment. And then this is one type of facade, the kind of open veranda facade that has a self-supporting precast structure. And then the other facade is this brick facade. And then on the plinth, you can see that the bricks are glazed, you know, like you'd expect in an industrial building where the uses on the ground floor are more robust. And so you need a brick surface which can take the wear and tear and which is easy to wash with a hose and a brush. Not that the uses will be create a lot of dirt in this case. That's this arcade that's in front of the kindergarten, and which makes a kind of outdoor play space for the kids. The view from the kindergarten, which was actually the first thing occupied. The apartments are completely full. There's a big demand for housing in this part of Antwerp. Antwerp is an amazing city, really lively city. The other kind of facade, so the facade that's not, so for this block, the other side, which I'll show you later, is the side that has the veranda, so it's facing west, I think, and this side is bedrooms. So the entrances to the apartment here, also here, industrial unit and part of the kindergarten, and then these windows to bedrooms, and you can see the kind of vertical proportioned windows with openings and a balustrade so you don't fall out, and a kind of very strong and robust tectonic of precast concrete string courses held by panels of brickwork. A very beautiful greenish, light green brickwork, which is a Flemish brick. One of the entrances to the apartments. This is a very low budget project. I mean, construction budgets in Flanders really are quite low, and it was a real challenge to control quality. The collaboration with the client was terrific, and with our local architects, we worked with Bureau for Bouwtechniek, who are a practice who only support other Flemish or foreign architects in the construction period of a project. They were great as well, but it was a challenge on site. You know, the contractors were not so easy to work with. And then this is the other side. So this is the side facing this remnant of the convent building that used to be on the site. So this is the biggest stretch of the veranda, where it has a more monumental order, which is kind of engaging with this big space, which is also completely public. It's part of a network of public spaces which are within the blocks, which is something that's quite common in different forms in Flemish cities. You have it in Antwerp, you have it in Ghent as well. You've seen that again, but the same elements of the ateliers with the veranda above, and then a view on the veranda, which is 2.4 meters deep, so really deep. You can get your table and your sofa out there. And the way this veranda itself has a kind of very particular and specific presence within the city. And it feels urban, but it also feels a bit industrial. It has some, it has some relationship, I guess, to the facade I showed you in the previous project of the St. Jakob Foundation in Zurich. Feels like a working space as well as being a balcony. Okay, now the last project I'm going to show you is in London. It's also urban. It's a building. It's not this building. This is a reference. This is a picture that Peter and I took almost 30 years ago when we used to walk around London and look for things like this, which are really about the diversity, the way even within 1990s London, which was a rather derelict place, which if you didn't think about it in the right way, you could be a little bit depressed about. Even places like this had an enormous potential in the way this was originally a distillery building, the way this building obviously had been added to and then added to again without much notice for matching the previous part of the distillery, but nonetheless, the combination of the three histories of this building are something of enormous formal invention. And it's something that Peter and I have always been really interested in. And in the project I'm going to show you, kind of 20 years later, we were able to achieve something quite similar to this. So the project I'm going to talk about is this one. It's the Newport Street Gallery. The client was Damien Hirst, the well-known British artist. And it's a building, it's a museum really, to show his collection, not his art, although there's a show that just opened this week of his art, but his collection. He has a collection of more than 3,000 works of art, from Renaissance art to Francis Bacon, to an amazing collection of Jeff Koons, as well as a collection of his own work. And this is a museum. It's free to go to it. And it's an amazing gesture of generosity on the part of Damien Hirst. And he was very closely involved in the project. And what's interesting about the project, it's urban. It's obviously in an area that still is rather industrial, but also has parts that are gentrified. There's the city of London over there, which would take about 45 minutes to walk from here to there. Waterloo Station is just over here. And it's a building where the three central buildings were listed scenery painting workshops. So these buildings were listed buildings which we had to keep. And then we demolished two much worse quality buildings on this end and this end, and we made new buildings. And all together, these kind of 5 buildings make one. And the way we remade the interiors of the existing warehouses didn't really exist. So there's new interiors inside. The way we organize the inside is so that the ground floor is a continuous network of galleries, and then there's 3 stairs in the building, and you can go up to a first floor suite of galleries, and then on the middle floor here, there's a pharmacy too, a restaurant, and then in this building, which is more like a warehouse building, there's offices and viewing rooms and a shop on the ground floor. So the way this is like that, like this picture, is that it's one thing, but it's one thing that's made out of a diversity of different forms. So it's a kind of it's taking different things and making a new whole. So in a way, it's a paradigm for the way I'm talking about the contemporary city or the 20th century city. So, but this is, unlike the previous buildings, this is a building which largely keeps existing structures, which I think is something we have always done a lot of in our office, and is something which is, I think, more and more important. We should not be demolishing buildings today. We should be reusing buildings that are already there. We cannot afford to waste the energy, the gray energy of demolishing and disposing of the material of a building. And I also think that if we didn't demolish so many buildings, that the identity and the vitality of the city would have a better chance of surviving the kind of recent brutal onslaught that late capitalism brings to bear on the city. So this is the ground floor. So you can see the existing building, which is all brick structure, but in order to make the new floor strong enough to hold the art that will be displayed there, there's a steel structure on the inside, so that the old structure becomes a hybrid between brick and steel. And then the new buildings have a steel structure, this one and this one, but then they have a brick facade, which is a full brick thick, so it holds itself up. So it's a self-bearing brick facade. So it's also a kind of hybrid structure. But whereas the existing building is, say, 70% brick and 30% steel, the new buildings are 30% brick and 70% steel in terms of what's bearing the loads. But by having these different kinds of hybrids, it means, again, we could avoid having silicon joints. We could really make a building where the building is stable and the loads are coming down in a kind of direct way. And then these stairs, this one, and this one, which are rather elaborate and very special, and I'll show them to you in a moment. They are brick structures on the inside and on the outside. So they're completely brick structures. And it's really these stairs which shift the building from its previous life as an industrial building into becoming something which is like a public building, which is kind of between everyday building and an institutional building. I mean, Damien Hirst was not interested in making this building pompous pompous. He wanted it to have to be robust and to have qualities, but he didn't want it to be tacky, obviously. But he was also interested that somehow it recognized the fact that it was going from something that was completely private, something which had been derelict for the last 30 years, it hadn't been used, to something which is public, and I think architecture is part of how you articulate that change in the use and in the life of a building. And this is the upper floor. So there's the galleries, and then this is a 12-meter high space, but with a bridge, and then the final gallery and the section. So this is the view along Newport Street, the existing buildings and the new buildings. The entrance is here. And it was quite difficult to decide on what the bricks of the new building should be, because the existing building really had the cheapest, lousiest bricks, and every week they would just pick whatever bricks were available for the lowest price. So the existing building, you can see it, have 5 different kinds of bricks. So when we were making the new building, we really had to pick a brick that was sort of between all of them. It's also not a very expensive, although this project is not a cheap project at all. It's quite an expensive project, but the bricks themselves are rather modest. And it really took a long time to find bricks that would sit comfortably next to the old bricks. And then these bricks in the base are the same bricks, but we used a process that was quite common in the 19th century, where you put salt on the bricks in the mix before you fire them in the kiln, and the salt leaves a dark deposit on the surface of the bricks. So they're the same bricks, but these just have this salt surface. There's this Jumbotron screen in the middle, which was a late addition, a kind of amazing thing, also very big. and it always has a program of moving or still images that relates to the exhibition at the time. So this is what it looked like when the Jeff Koons show was on last year. So that's the view from the viaduct. And you can see what I mean, that you can see this as 1, 2, maybe this is one alone, 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings. But we're also interested in how this whole thing reads as a single building on a single block in the city. It's the back. And then these are the galleries in the existing building. So you can see they're not completely neatened up. They still have the shape of the existing building. The clerestory lights are where the existing windows were, so they don't completely evenly light the space, but they give a lot of light. They have a big scale. They're 8 meters high. And then a gallery space on the top floor of the existing building where there were these roof lights, which obviously we changed. I mean, the only thing that's existing in this view are these trusses, which needed a lot of work to make them structurally stable, but there's new roof lights. And so those are very specially daylit galleries. And then the new gallery, which has this north light form and which has much more even natural lighting conditions. So even the inside of the space has this idea of a kind of consistency, but a diversity of scales and character within the suite of galleries, which I think in contemporary art is a very important thing. If you have every gallery the same size and the same character, I think it becomes very difficult to install a show. And then this is one of these stairs, which it took years to develop them. The stairs themselves are timber, and they were made by Deutsche Werkstatt Hellerau. They're one of only 2 people who could make them in the world. We did a tender which took forever to find the people, so that these are engineered timber structures which were made in Germany and then taken apart into 3 parts and then brought to site and then reassembled. And then they go into a space which is made, this quite complex elliptical space made in brick, which in the end was not so difficult to make, working with amazing bricklayers. And then the stair is supported in that brick structure. And you can see this, the handrail is laid into the brick, so the handrail becomes part of the structure of the space. Something that was also very difficult to make. The handrail is precast concrete, and of course every piece is different because it's sloping in elevation, but also in plan. So all of these things had to be resolved in Rhino, and then the Rhino model was given to the subcontractors who used the Rhino model to make production drawings to directly manufacture the precast, the timber structure, etc. A view down this beautiful stair and up, and brick clads the whole of the space. So this brick is holding the loads, but clearly the ceiling is not holding the loads. The ceiling bricks are glued onto a precast slab. So the brick is sometimes working in a technical way, but in other times it's about making all-encompassing surface in the building. So we don't never, although we're of course super interested in construction, we never want the construction to just be didactic. We're much more interested in the construction being something which gives character to the building. For us, the construction is the way in which you make an expressive architecture. And then this is the final space in the 5th building on the row, which is a kind of private gallery where Damien Hirst has his office and where all different sorts of art are installed at different times. That's all. So thank you very much.
Tak to bol Adam Caruso, ktorý pre vás teraz prednášal a prezentoval o svojej práci na Dňoch architektúry a dizajnu. A Adama ale máme online teraz aj na linke. Adam, can you hear us? Good evening.
Yes, I can hear you well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We really enjoyed your talk.
I hope it made sense to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Martin. I am the host of this event, but now I would like to introduce my colleague, Henrietta. She is a historian of an architecture, and she will debate with you. Henrietta, odovzdávam vám slovo a teda pre vás, ktorí nás sledujete, platí, že máte možnosť sa čokoľvek teraz aj opýtať.
Ďakujem. Good evening, Adam. It's a pleasure for me to be with you on a stage, even if it's not by person and only like a virtual stage. I would like to thank you also very much because your talk, it was very inspiring, and especially because you choose as a main topic the contemporary city and the problems that are somehow connecting with planning and construction of cities of today. I would like to start with this topic because in the beginning you mentioned that you have an idea of Bratislava as a town that was very typical for typical Central European town with this beautiful city structure built in 19th century. But I have to say that Bratislava is just the opposite. I don't want to disappoint you right in the beginning, but Bratislava, 60% of the urban tissue of the city was built in the 20th century. And Bratislava is really an example of how modern town planning, post-war modernism, how they influence the city structure. So this is not a 19th century nice city, it's a unplanned and perhaps unintended city. So I do strongly hope that we will have an opportunity to welcome you in Bratislava and to show you how the city really is, because I mean it's somehow fascinating anyway. Mm-hmm. But I would like to continue with the topic of town planning and topic of city, because I mean these are really the things which are very important for the contemporary architecture discussion. You've been talking about a kind of consistency which is characteristic for the cities that are somehow beloved or good cities or good examples of European cities. But I mean, as you show Milan or Bremen or Zurich, that they are kind of exceptions, that actually we faced much more cities that are in a state of being disturbed somehow. But on the other hand, I mean, this kind of this state of this disruption or state of unintentional planning might be perhaps a source of a very specific identity of such cities. Because when we are talking, yes, Bratislava is one of such examples, but we have Berlin, we have Rotterdam, we have other cities that are not really, consistent. So what is your idea about this tension?
I wasn't talking about consistent cities. I mean, I didn't talk about Paris or Prague, or Dubrovnik, or these classic cities where their identity is given either by one period or, in the case of Prague, in two distinct periods. I mean, I very intentionally talked about Milan, let's say. Milan, 70% of the buildings in Milan were built after the second, or in the 20th century, and more than half after the Second World War. But probably unlike Bratislava or cities like Zagreb, which I know, which before the Second World War were classic 19th century cities, but because of the damage that was done in the war, and then also the way in which reconstruction was done with centralized economies after the war, they really did have kind of big plans, even if they weren't completely carried out, but they were rebuilt in a kind of a utopian way. Whereas Milan, although people did draw up grand plans for Milan, they never were built. They only ever built little bits of them. And I guess the point I was making was that the culture of how you made a city building in Milan was so deep in the culture of the society, the clients, but also the architects, that they managed to, without a plan, still make something that has a sense, makes a very strong atmosphere, even though it's very, very heterogeneous. In Milan, you have modernist buildings by people like Ponti and Moretti, next to buildings that are neither modern nor not modern by Asnago Vender and Caccia di Mignoni, and then buildings which are much more traditional by Muzio and older architects. And all of these buildings somehow together make a city that has a fantastic quality. It is an unusual city, you're right. So it was damaged heavily in the war. It wasn't rebuilt the way, say, Munich was rebuilt in a kind of quite historicist way, but it still has many of the qualities of a great city. You could say a lot of that's to do with how deep urbanism is in Italian culture. But, in Britain, London was very damaged by the war, and then it was rebuilt according to fragments of utopias, maybe in a similar way to Bratislava. But the real damage to London, and that was the point I was making, that I think we're really at a critical point in the last 10 years. The real damage to London has been made in the last 15 to 20 years. It's been when you've had massive investment of global capital, so that buildings are being built that have nothing to do with London, which have very little to do with actually the demands for buildings in London. So many buildings are built and they're just empty. They're pure investment vehicles by offshore money, and the only purpose is to sink the money into London because it's safer than keeping all the money in China or in Dubai or somewhere like that. And that's a really terrible reason to build buildings. And I don't know if Bratislava has had that sort of development, but I know in Warsaw there's a lot of development like that, in Bucharest, and in certain cities in the center and the east of Europe where, when the economies shifted, they really became targets for inward investment, which wasn't very helpful inward investment. Yeah. But I guess, you shouldn't feel bad, because we've had the same thing in London where a lot of that investment comes from,
Yeah,
we also suffer.
I would say that we are approaching in a very, very similar direction. And London is often used as a good example how we should deal with a city here in Bratislava. And this is exactly a thing which perhaps could be discussed right now and here. What do you think about planning regarding the city? Because we face now a very, very tough discussion that perhaps it's better not to have a plan, as they have it in London, of course. And perhaps we should somehow throw away our Central European tradition of good planning, as it is still, for example, in Vienna. So
I don't agree with that. I don't. It's not because I think planning is a very successful or powerful tool, but I think that it's a combination of things that allows cities to develop in a reasonable way. So the building that I showed in Bremen, Bremen has, like all German cities and Swiss cities, it has a three-dimensional Richtplan, a legal plan, which tells you what volumes can be built in certain places. Then there's some places where there's some discretion. So if you have an architectural competition and good architects are invited, maybe you can build a little bit bigger. But there is a legal plan which kind of establishes a certain continuity, at least in the central parts of the city. And in addition, in the case of Bremen, there was a very good city architect, which was also the case in Antwerp when we won the competition for that project. And other projects that we are doing in, say, in Flanders or in Germany. And so you have a good city architect who knows how to deal with the politicians, but also with the developers. You have a good legal plan, which also has a bit of flexibility, you know, so we're just finishing a building in Cologne, for instance, where the same city architect who used to be in Bremen went to Cologne. And it was a competition for a very tough developer. And in the end, the deal was that if he chose our project, he could build a building that was 15 or 20% bigger, but he had to use us as architects, and he had to, you know, we had to design what was built in the end. And it's a kind of a deal. And it was difficult, the negotiations, but in the end, we had a lot of power that was given to us by the city architect. And the developer got exactly what they wanted. They got the area that they want and the quality. And, you know, I would say in the end, that was a good situation. And in Switzerland, it's usually like that, but the developers are getting more and more powerful, and the city architects are getting less powerful. And so even in the situation, there are less and less places where that situation of negotiation works. And actually what I'm describing isn't about a very active planning. It's about just having a good legal plan, and then also a little bit of discretion, you know, to respond to the demands of the market, but also to deliver something for the public, you know, the public qualities of the city.
Yeah. I mean, this is
I'm not optimistic. I think it's getting more and more difficult, you know. I'm not a great fan of capitalism, you know, so...
Yeah, I would say that we in post-socialist countries, most people are big fans of capitalism. Of course, that's natural after
yes, of course.
Our course of history. But speaking about Germany or Austria or Switzerland, we can feel this, let's say, good German tradition to how to deal with planning, with this kind of rationalism, we can call it in that way. We have also this kind of tradition here in Central Europe, but unfortunately in post-socialist countries we faced this kind of rupture, and the public or even the architects are quite, in a negative mood when talking about modern planning, because it was applied restrictive or authoritarian in a previous period. So we are facing a kind of double crisis that it's connected with a historical memory, and it's also connected with the problem of general crisis of planning. But
there is a crisis of planning. And of course, big planning always is an expression of power, you know, and that's very problematic. And even cities that we love, like even Milan, which, you know, Italy never really had a very strong central power other than before and during the Second World War. And so there is a real spreading of power, but the people who built Milan in the 20th century were a kind of enlightened oligarchy. They were haute bourgeois, very well-educated, rich people who they had a sense of civic responsibility, but, you know, they were in a way very, very powerful. They were like the Medici a little bit in 14th and 15th century Tuscany. And, you know, modern planning, I'm not going to defend it. There are a few examples where it was done very well, but on the whole, the idea of scientific modernist planning, it was a disaster. It's a really bad idea, and it's a kind of misinterpretation, misappropriation of kind of pseudoscientific principles applied to spatial practice, which it doesn't work, you know. In the same way that, you know, the socialist era in Eastern Europe, scientific models were used for politics as well. You know, I think they're different things. And that was something in the 20th century that people thought might work, but it didn't really work. It didn't really work.
You're absolutely right, but on the other hand, we have also a heritage of masterpieces of modern planning or modern architecture that are still present in our cities, and they are most of them are somehow connected with public spaces, with public services, and actually the basic of post-war European developments were done in connection with modern planning and in the idea of welfare state. So,
can I ask, in Bratislava, do people like those projects? Because I went with my students a couple of years ago to Bulgaria, and we met, and it was and Bulgaria, I mean, Sofia is a very weird city. It's very ugly, and it was like a little village until the 20th century, but they do have a legacy from the communist era, the socialist era, of some very fine buildings, and they were all under threat by the current political regime because they were used as a kind of negative symbol. And we met with a lot of young architectural historians, people in their 30s, doing PhDs and postdoc work on these monuments, and it was super interesting because these people in their 30s were defending them because they were saying, actually, it's part of our history in a city that doesn't have a lot of history anyway, and it's just being used as a negative symbol, you know, and it was very, very strange, you know. But it happens in Britain too, you know, like the demolition of Robin Hood Gardens, which is not a great building, but certainly didn't need to be demolished. You know, it could have been renovated, and it's part of a history of the welfare state building, and there were all sorts of excuses to demolish it, but the real reason was just to build more private housing. That's it.
Exactly. You know? I mean, we are in the middle of the same fight as in Bulgaria and probably as in Britain as well, that we are somehow trying to protect the heritage from the post-war modernism, which on the one hand we are not really successful, but we're trying hard. This was also something that I wanted to touch because you have not mentioned it in your lecture, but you have done a restructuring or renovation of the concert hall in Barbicon, which is also an example of such an architecture piece. And we are right now facing a very similar problem here in Bratislava, that we have a wonderful masterpiece of architecture, which is a Congress Center, and they intend to demolish it because they think it's impossible to upgrade it. So I wanted to ask, was it that difficult to upgrade this concert hall?
Well, what's very interesting, I mean, I live at the Barbicon also, although I only moved there when we were doing the project. And the Barbicon is a really interesting example because I remember when as a kid, my uncle used to have an apartment there, and it used to be like the Wild West, like nobody went there when it was first built in the 70s, you know? And then when I first moved to London, and I used to go to a lot of concerts at the concert hall, so that's in the 80s, people would just say how horrible it was, and you know how ugly it was, and how you would get lost in the Barbicon. Because the Barbicon's not just an art center, it's a whole area of housing with 2,000 apartments and an art center and lots of things. But what's interesting is that the city around the Barbicon has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years. So Hoxton, Shoreditch, lots of the newish trendy areas of London are directly next to the Barbicon. So what used to be an area that didn't really have a very multifunctional life became much more vibrant, you know, in the day, in the nighttime, on the weekend, during the weekdays. And young people started to kind of explore, and younger people in the Barbicon. And now the Barbicon is super popular. It was always popular with the people who lived there because it's a really special place to live with beautiful gardens, and it's very well built. But the public, lots of people go there now. And what's really interesting is that the foyers for the art center, they made them open, and there's free Wi-Fi, and lots of people just work there, you know, during the week. And then there's a street market just outside the Barbicon. They get food, they bring it back to the foyers, or they buy food in the foyers, and it's become a completely urbanized part of the city. And yet it's a kind of, it's not a very advanced, it's a kind of second generation utopian modernist project. You know, it's completely a modernist idea of the city. It's very well built though, and it's very well maintained, which of course is one of the things that a lot of modernist projects suffered from. Being part of the welfare state, they were built a bit too cheaply, a bit too quickly, and so they had technical problems. But that's not always the case. There's some amazing modernist new towns or town extensions in Sweden, for instance, very well built. And they were very popular when they were built in the 60s, and they just became less popular. And then they became where refugees, communities were dumped, you know, and then these social problems were invented, you know, they were engineered because of who had to live in them. And it's nothing to do with the architecture or the connectivity of those places. It's completely a political decision, actually. Sweden is very interesting because, of course, you know, they built these things. It wasn't to do with destruction in the war. They weren't in the war, and they were really built some amazing modern cities, and that were very, very popular for the first 10 or 15 years of their life. And then as Sweden became more bourgeois and people started to move back to the center of town, there was this kind of a fiction told about these places. It's very, very interesting, and very unfair, really, and also very, what we were talking about before, even in Sweden, it's difficult to protect these places. There are people fighting for them, but the politicians, you know, they have no sympathy.
Yeah, not only politicians, also the private owners are not really interested. I don't know how it is in the case of Barbicon. It's private owned, or
well, it was built by the city, and it's paradoxical. So when people started to move in the late 70s, you had to be interviewed to live there, and it was really a kind of whole section of society. So there were people who worked in the city, in the banks, and in the law firms. There were teachers. There were all the different strata of society living there. There were families and single people. But then after Thatcher and the right to buy, which was very slowly taken up in the Barbicon, because actually the people in the Barbicon, they liked that they were renting. But we've lived there now for 19 years, and we bought our apartment. And of course, that was much easier. You just had to have enough money, and you could live there. There was no interview or anything like that.
Yeah, and you mean at the kind of such a kind of projects that they are, let's say, in long term sustainable. That are we able to protect them for the next generations?
Well, the Barbican is
well,
protected.
perhaps this is a kind of exception.
It's a monument,
icon.
and I would say Switzerland is interesting because I think in Switzerland there isn't this antipathy towards modernism. So there's modern housing areas which are, some of them are not even that amazing, and they're being renovated. And the fabric of the buildings are being renovated, but also the social mix is being looked at. You know, in Switzerland, they do demolish things, but they also, if there's big public projects, they really make a huge effort to renew them so that they work both, you know, in terms of sustainability, but that they work socially. And there's been some very interesting projects in that respect.
Yeah, because... Yeah, I mean, also in Britain, that you have several examples that are really, how to say, good examples of reconstruction and refurbishment of brutalist buildings. And you've been talking about the Robin Hood gardens, but in the same time as they've been demolished, the Economist complex was renovated. So it's like.
Yeah, the last renovation of The Economist was a bit not so great, but it's more or less okay. But The Economist building is also, it's a monument, you know, it's listed, and so it has certain protection legally.
Yeah. Robin Hood was not protected.
List it, you know.
Yeah, that's true. And when we are speaking about these grand projects, what about Cambernauld in Scotland? And it's
I've never been. Have you been there?
Yeah, I've been there, and it was quite obsolete. So I'm asking if it's still like intact or.
I can't imagine it's intact. It's probably like Mad Max or something. But I'll visit one day. My partner Peter's probably been there since I have. I don't know, it always looked very tough, Cumbernauld, didn't
Yeah,
it?
but this is amazing place, really. And when you look at all these movies and these stories that are connected with it, it's a great story. I think we have also some questions from our audience. So I think we should give the floor to them now because we will never stop to discuss this topic.
So here is one question. If you could please compare the British and European, he means German-speaking Europe, architecture and building environment or culture. And why do you think that the number of important British architects, as for instance, David Chipperfield, Ferguson Bates, or your office, are building more in Europe than in the UK?
Yeah.
Is this, he continues that if there's something with politics or is just something about winning competitions?
Well, it's to do with competition. So first of all, in Switzerland and always in Switzerland, but certainly in Germany, any important site, even if it's a private building, will have a competition which the city manages. And there'll be a city architect. And there are a few very good city architects in Germany. Not that many, but a few. And those city architects decide who to invite for the competition. And they're involved in the judging with other jurors. But they're also mediating between the developer and what they want, and between the politicians and what they want. And so you have these figures or these processes which are really about, first of all, deciding this is an important site and therefore we really care about what's built on this site. And then they make a big effort and they have legal mechanisms where they have some control. In London, there might be competitions for public buildings or competitive processes, but if it's a private building, the developer will just say, it's my money, I'm going to decide. That's end of story. And there might be a competition, but the competition will be completely done by the developer. I mean, we're doing one big developer building in London now for amazing developer, very civilized. He's actually German, but he's working in London. And the way we got the job was that he asked 3 developer friends who happened to be in Germany, and they all recommended us, you know? So we got it directly because of the work we've been doing in Germany. So it's completely to do with the process, and the process is of course to do with the politics and the culture of architecture, that the kind of the way that the city, at least the central part of cities are developed, is still considered a kind of public discussion in Germany or in Switzerland or in Belgium, you know, in the last 15 years since they have the Baumeister in Flanders. In Britain, building a private building is a financial transaction. That's it.
Yeah.
And so that's the difference, you know. It's not that you can't, I mean, we obviously have projects in Britain, and it's not that you can't build in a beautiful way in Britain. You can, you know, like the project we did for Damien Hirst, the things that we did there, or at the Tate, which I didn't show today, that technically what you can do with construction in Britain is as good as anywhere else, you know. Maybe the average building is not as well built, but the skills within the industry exist.
Yeah.
But it's completely to do with the client, the relationship of the politics, the client, and the importance of design.
We have one more question. If you collaborate with landscape architects as well, because for he's writing that some exteriors and inner country art of your work look rather bare or cold to Eiko, who is asking.
Which is he talking about? I don't agree. That's a very unfair comment. We do collaborate with very good landscape architects, and I think we're also architects who are very, very interested. We're not architects who look just at the building as an object. We're really interested in the building as part of a much wider environment, physically and socially. And as a result of that, we are very, very interested in landscape. And so, I mean, the projects I showed didn't have a lot of landscape, but for instance, the project I showed in Antwerp, it has this courtyard, which is a soft landscape. I mean, the building just finished, so the landscape is not very mature yet, but that's a shared space that the atelier, the people who live there, the kindergarten that's on the courtyard, all of those people will share that space. And the project in Bremen also had the courtyard. It's not a soft space, but it's a hof. It's a city courtyard, and it's a typology which exists all over Bremen and northern Germany. And we were making a version of that courtyard, so it's paved with a local stone, a porphyry stone. It has some trees in it. It has a bench that goes all the way around the courtyard, and it's a very heavily used space. People have lunch there. There's concerts on the weekend. It's kind of part of the network of public spaces around the building.
Yeah.
But we do work with landscape architects. We work with 2 or 3 landscape architects all the time. In Zurich, they're Zurich-based landscape architects, and it's something we're very, very interested in.
Thank you. I don't know if Henrietta has something more.
I would like to perhaps approach a little bit to the end, but we need, and definitely we need to touch the last project you have shown us, which is the gallery of Damien Hirst, because this is an exceptional piece of architecture and an exceptional man who actually contracted you. So there are 2 things I would like to touch. First, perhaps it's a little bit like naive, but how was the collaboration with such a, let's say, complex person?
He is a very complex person, and he's also a very busy person. The reason he asked us to do the project was that he, at the time, was a Gagosian artist, and we've done a number of projects for Gagosian Gallery, which is this very powerful private art gallery. And he'd had a show at one of our London galleries that we designed, and he really liked it. So he asked us to look at this project. He was very, very involved. He was, he got very enthusiastic about certain things. He had very strong opinions. So in terms of the art space, I would say when we started doing the project, the art space was less neutral, and he wanted us really to make it more neutral. But on the other hand, he didn't want us to regularize the gallery so much, something I talked about, that you would still understand that these galleries were in existing buildings. There were certain details, like the way the stair was made, that he was very, very engaged with and enthusiastic with it. And it was only because of his engagement that we built them. They were very, very difficult to build. He rented a warehouse where we did mock-ups to see if it was possible to do, because I wasn't sure it was possible to build, but it was. And he said, there's no way we're going to do that. And then the pharmacy, the restaurant we did, which was a kind of a reconstruction of the original pharmacy that he built in Notting Hill in the 90s, that was a complete Gesamtkunstwerk. So he was completely involved in everything to do with that. And we collaborated with him in order to figure out how to build it. And it was very, very ambitious, the technique used for it. So he was completely involved. And yeah, he was a great client.
Yeah.
Demanding, but good clients are demanding, you know.
This is really, I would call it a unique cooperation, because when one compares the way how he does his art, and then you see these buildings connected to one piece of architecture, this is something I would say different, but perhaps there are very strong connections, as you put it already. Perhaps we can finish with this. I would like to mention, because you said that there are some, as you show the facade of the gallery, there was advertising for Jeff Koons exhibition, but right now there is already a new exhibition on Damien Hirst. Yes, the end of a century. So perhaps we can invite our audience to go there, to visit the gallery and to have the unique possibility or the occasion to see the work of the artist in the gallery of the artist, which is amazing.
The gallery was never intended for his work, it's for his collection, but of course we designed the floors so that they are strong enough to hold his work, because some of his tank pieces are so heavy, like 70 tons heavy, so the gallery can accommodate it. Yeah, and so there's a big range of his most famous work, which he's bought back, which he owns now, and he's showing it. I haven't seen the show yet because I've been in Zurich, but I'm going back to London tomorrow, so I'll go and see it. Yeah.
Okay, so bon voyage.
Yeah, thank you.
And
very nice to meet you. Huh?
Thank you for being with us. It was really a great pleasure and fun, and we enjoyed all of us. And
Hope
have a nice
see you
evening.
in Bratislava personally.
Okay, in the future, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Bye.
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 Ďakujeme veľmi pekne Adamovi Carusovi, Alexandra aj tebe, Henrieta, predovšetkým tebe. Videli ste Clubovku s Adamom Carusom a bola to veľmi príjemná diskusia, dobre sa počúvala, sympatický a teda talentovaný umelec.